The path of a red blood cell. Red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, are the most common type of blood cell. There are other types of blood cells, but for this presentation we'll be focusing on red blood cells. The red blood cell's function is to carry oxygen throughout the body and remove carbon dioxide. Red blood cells are rounded and relatively flat in comparison to other cells and feature an indented center, as you can see right here. They're produced inside the bones, specifically in the red bone marrow. They live for approximately 120 days before they die. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus, are covered with a lipid and protein composing membrane, as you can see here, and they contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that exists within the red blood cells that allows for oxygen transportation. It is composed of 4 protein molecules called globulin chains that are interconnected. Each of these chains contains the porphyrin compound called heme, which includes an iron atom that is responsible for binding oxygen. When hemoglobin is oxygenated, it is called oxyhemoglobin and appears bright red. When oxygen levels are in a reduced state, it appears to be purplish red in color. Iron is the primary contributor to this red color of blood. Hemoglobin contributes to the maintenance and the shape of the red blood cell. An abnormal hemoglobin structure can alter the shape of the red blood cell and diminish its ability to flow through the blood vessels. When red blood cells die, their hemoglobin is broken up. The iron is salvaged and sent over to the bone marrow to be recycled. The rest of the hemoglobin forms bilirubin, which is a chemical excreted into the bile, giving feces its usual color. The oxidation of cells is a source of energy for most mammals. Oxygen is involved in a process called cell respiration, in which a glucose molecule and an oxygen molecule are converted to water, carbon dioxide, and adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. ATP is the main source of chemical energy for most cells, and responsible for many cellular processes. This reaction occurs in the organelle mitochondria, which is aptly named the powerhouse of the cell. The oxygen required for this reaction is attained via the circulatory and respiratory systems. While oxygen is abundant and available, aerobic respiration occurs. While there is a deficit of available oxygen, anaerobic respiration occurs. Aerobic respiration is much more effective in producing ATP than anaerobic respiration, demonstrating the importance of oxygen. We begin the path of the blood cell in the right atrium of the heart, which receives blood that has already been circulated throughout the body. It receives the blood from the body through the inferior and superior vena cava, depending on which part of the body it is returning from. The blood then passes from the right atrium to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries transport the blood to the lungs to be oxidized. The oxygen required to oxidize blood cells is inhaled from the atmosphere by the respiratory system. Oxygen, along with other chemicals, is inhaled in the oral and nasal cavities and travels through the system into the alveoli. Alveoli are small sacs in the lungs that are lined with capillaries. This is the primary site of gas exchange. Carbon dioxide, in which the blood is abundant at this point in the system due to cellular respiration, is diffused through the capillaries, and oxygen is absorbed by the blood cells. This gas exchange happens as a result of a gas partial pressure gradient across the alveoli and the capillaries. The difference between the partial pressures of the gases allows the infusion of oxygen and the diffusion of carbon dioxide as the gas molecules move from an area of high concentration to lower concentration as the gas exchange. The carbon dioxide is then exhaled out of the respiratory system, releasing it into the atmosphere. The blood cells are then pumped back to the heart via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The oxygen-rich blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle via the mitral valve. This is where the pulmonary circulatory system ends and the systemic circulation begins. The left ventricle, which is very powerful, contracts and is responsible for systemic circulation. The oxygenated blood is pumped throughout the entire body. To do this, it passes through the aortic valve and the aorta, which is the body's largest artery. The blood passes through the aortic arches and branches, which branch and circulate to the entire body. The blood reaches whichever organ or part of the body it is intended for through various blood vessels called arteries. The oxygen and nutrients are diffused to the target through capillaries while absorbing carbon dioxide. This process is very similar to the diffusion of CO2 in the lungs, but in reverse. Metabolic waste and carbon dioxide are diffused out of the cell and into the blood, while oxygen and glucose are diffused out of the blood and into the cell to be used for cell respiration. The blood then returns to the heart via veins and is pumped back into the right atrium via the inferior and superior vena cava. Systemic circulation is a higher pressure circuit than the pulmonary circulation because it requires greater force to transport higher volumes of blood further throughout the body. Once in the right atrium, the cycle begins again and pulmonary circulation occurs. The most common red blood cell disease is anemia, which can exist in many different forms. Anemia describes the condition when there aren't enough red blood cells to carry the appropriate amount of oxygen in the body. It is important to note that some red blood cell diseases are hereditary, whereas others are caused by illnesses or lack of iron or vitamins. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited hereditary disease which affects the shape of the red blood cell. When diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, the red blood cells look like crescents instead of the rounded, indented non-donuts indicative of a healthy red blood cell. These cells are aptly named sickle cells. Due to the abnormal shape, sickle cells aren't able to flow smoothly through blood vessels, causing blockages. These blockages result in acute or chronic pain and potential infection or liver damage. Sickle cells die at an accelerated rate compared to healthy blood cells. Their lifespan is 10 to 20 days instead of 120. As a result, the supply of red blood cells cannot keep up with demand. Blood varies person to person. There are 4 different blood types: A, B, AB, or O. Your blood type is hereditary, and your blood type determines to whom you can donate and from who you can receive blood. Type O is the universal donor, and type AB is the universal recipient. These donations are acquired via blood transfusion. Blood is drawn from a donor, stored in a bag for later use, and slowly intravenously ejected into the recipient's blood vessels. Some questions for our TA. How does blood without hemoglobin transport oxygen? For example, the ice fish or snails have blood but lack hemoglobin. Since the main function of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen, how do you think these animals absorb oxygen without it? Are there forms of oxygenation possible? In essence, can an organism oxygenate without the use of blood? Do processes like this exist on Earth? We know that red blood cells typically survive for around 120 days and are formed in the bone marrow. But what happens to them when they die, and where do they break down?